Hi, my name is Donald McClellan. I'm a finance management professional interested in professional development and corporate training. This video arises from an evaluation of learning course that looks at the practices that support the assessment and evaluation strategies used in education and training. The video is specifically about informal assessments, the use of classroom assessment techniques or CATs, and one in particular, the categorizing grid technique. Before we get to the specifics of the categorizing grid, let's go over the background of informal assessment. Instructors use a variety of methods, some formal and others informal, to measure how much and how well their students are learning. Informal assessment, including CATs, refers to techniques used to obtain feedback on the teaching effectiveness, but not to assign grades. The assessment is done to check on student understanding and identify learning gaps. This book by Angelo and Cross is still the standard reference on classroom assessment techniques, even after 25 years. With the increased use of technology in teaching, there are a number of new online techniques, including games and interactive quizzes. Informal assessment and classroom assessment techniques are formative assessments. They're almost always anonymous, not graded, and focused on improving the quality of student learning, as indicated by the assessment results. CATs are feedback devices to collect data on student learning and to ultimately improve it. The assessment techniques used is context-specific to respond to the particular needs and disciplines being taught in each classroom situation. There are a number of assessment techniques available, so how does the instructor choose the right tool for the particular situation? The key is to tie the assessment technique to the teaching goals of the course and what students are intended to learn. Having teaching goals allows for assessment and measuring of learning progress. Angelo and Cross developed their list of assessment techniques based on the 7 factors shown, and then cross-referenced them back to the teaching goals, such as higher-order thinking skills, discipline-specific skills and knowledge, and work or career preparation that are emphasized in the particular course. Let's now move on to the categorizing grid assessment technique. In many disciplines, especially at an introductory level, a first step to real problem solving is learning basic concepts, definitions, and terminology. This would include courses in biological and life sciences, accounting and business studies, as well as vocational, trade, and technologist programs where students need to learn the underlying rules for what goes with what. Categorizing grids can be a useful diagnostic aid for measuring comprehension for those items that lend themselves easily to logical classification. A categorizing grid is a technique to assess interrelationships and firm up basic or introductory concepts, what goes with what, and possibly what are similarities and differences. To begin, you need to identify a topic that possesses classifications. Categorizing grid exercises can be effective in small and large classes and useful for online adaptations to test learners' grasp of concepts. Grouping items, text, or graphics is a common online practice for many types of surveys. In class, students could work in groups and then share the results to the class. The assessment is often done at the end of a section or the end of a lecture containing lots of comparative information. The grids can also be used as homework or to generate group-based online or in-class discussions. Here are some examples. In biology, the grid can differentiate between vertebrates and invertebrates. In life sciences, the grid can correlate symptoms with types of medical conditions. Finally, in accounting, the grid can be used to distinguish between operating and capital expenditures. The categorizing grid is basically a sorting exercise. It develops analytical skills, the ability to draw reasonable inferences, and memory skills. This form of assessment works for introductory level courses where students are learning terminology, concepts, and theories of a subject that can be grouped or categorized to assist with remembering and recall. Students are provided the categories and then a list of scrambled items of subordinate terms, images, equations, or real objects that belong to one or another of the categories. Students must then sort the items into the correct category. Analysis of the outcomes will identify patterns of incorrect responses that can help determine which kinds of examples or categories are most difficult for students. With this feedback, the instructor can determine whether students understand what goes with what, and students can also become aware of learning gaps for their own categorizing rules. Categorizing grid is relatively simple to adapt and use given the appropriate subject matter and situation. The most common use of this assessment technique is compare and contrast, and sort subordinate items based on their differences. This example has 2 categories to assess the understanding of the differences between the practices of financial accounting and management accounting. There are 3 attributes listed that have identifiable differences between the 2 types of accounting. These scrambled 6 subordinate items can be categorized. The assessment requires the items to be sorted into the appropriate category. These two distinct accounting practices and concepts are an appropriate fit for a compare and contrast categorization grid assessment. The second application of the categorizing grid would be where students are familiar with the basic concepts of the categories, and the teaching goal is to have students apply the concepts to new situations or items. In management accounting, one of the key concepts is variance analysis and the separation of a cost variance between standard or budget and actual results into two components: the variance due to price variations and the variance due to the quantity of the input for both materials and labor. These are the basic concepts that it is assumed that students are familiar with and can apply to new situations. Items would be presented that describe new or real-life events, and the students would be required to analyze and then sort the item to the appropriate category based on their interpretation of the item content. Each new item requires analysis and interpretation. The assessment for new situations or items reinforces the student's understanding of the underlying concepts. The major advantage of this assessment technique is its simplicity. As mentioned earlier, it fits where students are learning terminology, concepts, or theories of a subject that can be grouped or categorized. It can identify where specific information needs reinforcement or further review. It can be adapted for learning management systems and online review of new concepts that occur beyond a formal classroom. The limitations of this assessment technique is it can only be used in certain situations where the information logically fits being categorized. It works well where it fits the learning content. Best practices for this assessment technique are to use it only where it is appropriate, the right tool at the right time. As with other classroom assessments, it requires student follow-up as soon as possible to clarify and reinforce the learning as required. The feedback for students depends on how the categorizing grid assessment is employed. It can be used in the classroom, at the end of the class, as homework, or adapted and used online. Regardless, it is critical that the results are analyzed and any identified areas of concern followed up on to ensure that the expected learning takes place and the teaching goals are achieved. If you'd like more information on this assessment technique or assessment techniques in general, your starting point would be Angelo and Cross. Many post-secondary institutions have assessment technique information as instructor reference materials on their websites or learning centers. I hope you found this interesting and worthwhile, and I thank you for your time and attention.